In part 1, we started our discussion of names and the rules that they have to follow. Let's continue now, picking up where we left off. Now, I said before that we can't use spaces in our names because that breaks the name really up into two separate names. Suppose I want to have an object that holds the weight of my car. And so I decided to call it car weight. And I write it this way, car space weight. Well, now I've got two separate objects, one called car, one called weight. So if I want to stick them together somehow, so this is wrong. Don't do that. If I want to stick them together, I can use the underscore character. That is right. That is a single name for something that is car weight. And I said before, don't use the minus sign. If you use the minus sign and you write this, processing will think what you're trying to do is create a little piece of math. You're trying to write car minus weight. And that may or may not make sense to it. It probably won't make sense, and you'll get some sort of a crazy error. So this is wrong too. The minus sign and the underscore, here they are side by side, are different beasts. And one is allowed and one is not. You can't use the minus. You'll get car minus weight. So you always want to use the underscore. So if I want car weight, as we just saw above, I could write it this way. There's another way to write it. Some people decide to use capitals. And this used to be just a crazy thing to have an embedded capital. But companies have been doing this now for many years. And I think it looks a little less bizarre than it used to. It actually has a name. This way of writing things is called camel case, because those capital letters that stick up between the lowercase letters might remind you of a camel's humps. So this version of car weight is the camel case version. This doesn't really have a name. It might just be called the underscore version. Now, there are a couple of other rules, and then there are a couple of conventions. One of the rules in names, let's clear all this away. One of the other rules is, although you are allowed to use the digits 0 through 9, you may not start with a digit. It's just one of those things. Just keep it in mind. You can start with any letter. You can start with any capital letter. Whoops, I have a colon in there. But you can't start with a number. Now, the number can be inside. It just can't be at the beginning. So if you want to have an object named for your favorite book, The Three Musketeers, you might want to write this. But don't do it because that starts with a number. And that's the one place numbers can't appear. So you could write this. Or you could write Musketeers 3. Or there are 3 Musketeers. These are all fine. But the version that begins with the number is not allowed. Now, there are a couple of conventions that I use that I recommend you use because I'll be using them throughout the course. And these are conventions that are shared by a lot of people. One of them is don't start with an underscore character. Technically, you're allowed to, but for technical reasons, I suggest you don't. For the same technical reasons I won't get into, I suggest you don't end with an underscore. You'll see people do it, but I recommend against it. You can absolutely go crazy with the underscores in between, and you can go totally crazy. This is perfectly legal. It's kind of silly and error prone, and you're asking for trouble, but it's legal. The others are legal too, but I really suggest don't begin or end with an underscore. Another rule that I'm going to follow for quite a long time is that all of my object names are going to begin with a lowercase letter. And the reason for that is that later on in the course, we will start naming things with an uppercase letter at the beginning, and that's going to have special meaning for us. Giving things good names is really important because when you come back to your own programs in 3 months or 6 months, you're almost going to be seeing them for the first time. You'll have written them so long ago, you might have forgotten how they work. And by the same token, if you share your programs with anyone else, they really will be newcomers. They're going to have no idea what's going on, and they're going to have to try to figure out what your program does by reading it. And the names are going to be a big clue, as well as comments and other information that you put in there. When you first read someone else's program, because you got it on the web, say, or someone else's work, and you try to figure out what it's doing, if all of the objects are named things like A, B, C, D, and E, as opposed to number of apples on hand or size of automobile, if instead they're just these single letters, A, B, and C, you'll have a really hard time figuring out what's going on. So descriptive names are great. I had a friend in college who named all of his objects for movie monsters. So if he had a fruit stand program, for example, keeping track of the inventory for his fruit stand, the number of apples on hand, that might be called Dracula. And then if somebody placed an order for some apples, the number of apples they requested would be Frankenstein. And so you would see stuff in his program where the actual program would be things like the new value of Dracula is Dracula minus Frankenstein. And it was crazy. And it was very cute. And it was very funny for about the first 15 seconds. And then it drove absolutely everyone crazy forever thereafter. Don't do that. Give yourself a break and pick names that are descriptive of the objects you're describing. So to summarize what we know about names, use lowercase letters, uppercase letters, the digits 0 through 9, and the underscore, and nothing else. So remember, if we want to make something called pool depth, we can write it pool underscore depth, or we can use camel case, pool depth, but not pool minus depth, because that's a little bit of math. So don't do that. I recommend don't start with an underscore. Don't end with an underscore. You can, but please don't. Also, don't start with a capital letter. And remember, spelling matters and case matters. So chair and choir are two entirely different things, even though they just differ by one letter. And my peach is not the same as my peach. Is not the same as my peach. That one has a capital M at the start. Those are all completely different objects. Keep this in mind. Oh, and do not begin with a number. 3 peaches. That one processing won't even let you do. So those are the rules for naming. And if you keep them in mind, you will be fine. Don't worry about messing them up. If you mess up a name, if you use something that's illegal, or if you create a typo and you refer to an object with the wrong name, processing will let you know. It will tell you that you have an error. The reason for knowing all these rules is that will help you understand the error, fix it, make it right, and you'll be off.